A train still passes through this town, but it never stops. There are no passengers waiting, no families waving from the platform, no one left to ask where the town went. Hidden in the marshes at the southern edge of San Francisco Bay, a handful of collapsing buildings are slowly sinking into the earth. This is Drawbridge, California. And more than a century ago, the railroad didn't pass through this town. The railroad created it. In 1876, the South Pacific Coast Railroad was building a faster route between Alameda and Santa Cruz. But to cross the marshlands, trains had to pass over two movable bridges. Someone had to operate them. So a railroad employee was sent into the marsh. His name was George Mundersheets. His job was simple. When boats approached, he opened the bridges. When they passed, he closed them again. At first, there was almost nothing there. Just marsh, water, railroad tracks, and one man. Then his friends began to visit. They came to fish, they came to hunt, some stayed overnight. Mundersheets charged them 50 cents to sleep in his cabin. And slowly, something strange happened. People began building homes. A settlement appeared where no town was ever supposed to exist. Drawbridge was born. To understand how unusual Drawbridge was, you have to understand the land around it. This was not an easy place to build a town. The marsh was wet, unstable, and constantly changing. There were no ordinary streets connecting Drawbridge to the outside world. For much of its history, the railroad was not simply transportation. It was Drawbridge's connection to everything beyond the marsh. Food arrived by train. Building materials arrived by train. Mail, visitors, and new residents followed the same tracks. Imagine living in a town where almost everything you needed came along one narrow railroad line. If the train arrived, Drawbridge remained connected. If it didn't, the marsh was waiting. By the 1920s, the lonely railroad stop had become something completely different. Around 90 structures stood in the marsh. Cabins, hunting clubs, and 2 hotels. On busy weekends, hundreds of visitors arrived by train. They came to hunt ducks, to fish, to drink, and to disappear from ordinary life for a while. Drawbridge had no police department, no fire department, no church, and no traditional streets. The railroad tracks were effectively its main street. People lived by the tides, and they seemed to like it that way. During Prohibition, one hotel reportedly served home-brewed beer. Another had a gambling room and a ballroom. Out in the marsh, it felt like nobody was watching. But living in Drawbridge was not easy. There were no stores. For years, there was no electricity, and there was no normal plumbing system. When large objects arrived at the station, residents moved them using homemade carts, refrigerators, stoves, whatever they needed. The railroad wasn't just transportation. It was their connection to the outside world, and the tide was always present. One resident later remembered watching a fish swim beneath her stove when the water came in. That's how close Drawbridge lived to the marsh. For a place so isolated, Drawbridge developed a surprising reputation. People did not come here because it was convenient. They came because it felt far away from everything. The hunting clubs became gathering places. Visitors shared meals, stories, and long evenings after returning from the marsh. For a time, Drawbridge was not simply a railroad stop. It was a destination. Imagine the wooden walkways filled with visitors, boots wet from the marsh, hotel rooms occupied, meals being prepared for hunters returning at the end of the day. At night, lights glowed from the buildings above the dark water. Beyond the town was the marsh. Inside Drawbridge, there were voices, music, and conversation. That is what makes the silence today so difficult to imagine. The buildings now sinking into the marsh were once filled with people. Drawbridge was alive. But the same environment that gave the town its identity would eventually help destroy it. The waters around Drawbridge began to change, and the town changed with them. Drawbridge had always depended on a delicate balance. The town needed the marsh, and the marsh needed water moving through it in the right way. The birds, the fish, and the wildlife that attracted visitors were all part of the same ecosystem. Change the water, and everything else begins to change with it. As communities around the South Bay expanded, more water was needed elsewhere. Fresh water that once helped feed the marsh was diverted for farms and growing cities. At the same time, sewage and pollution entered the surrounding wetlands. The water deteriorated, wildlife declined, and the reason people had traveled to Drawbridge began to disappear. Drawbridge did not lose its future in a single night. There was no one disaster that destroyed the town. The system that had kept it alive was slowly coming apart. The surrounding region was growing. Water was diverted, pollution and environmental damage affected the marsh. Hunting declined. Visitors stopped coming in the same numbers. Then the trains began to stop less often. Drawbridge had been built around one simple promise. The railroad would bring people. When the people stopped arriving, the town had almost nothing left. One by one, residents left. Cabins were abandoned. Wooden walkways deteriorated. Buildings began leaning into the marsh. By 1979, Drawbridge had become a ghost town. But the town didn't disappear. Not completely. The buildings remained, empty, weathered, slowly sinking. Today, Drawbridge sits within a protected wildlife refuge. Reaching the town is illegal and unsafe. The old railroad tracks remain the only direct route through the settlement, and the structures that survive continue to deteriorate. Buildings collapse, wood rots. The marsh slowly reclaims the ground beneath them. But there is another problem. The people who remember Drawbridge are disappearing too. Historians and volunteers have spent years trying to preserve its story. But records fade, memories vanish, and eventually, there may be no one left who remembers the town as it was. Which brings us back to the train. More than a century ago, trains brought people into Drawbridge. Hunters, visitors, supplies, new residents. Without the railroad, Drawbridge might never have existed. Today, trains still travel through the town, but they don't stop. Passengers may catch a brief glimpse of collapsing buildings through the window. Then the train moves on. The same railroad that once gave Drawbridge life now passes through its remains. Maybe that's the saddest thing about forgotten towns. They don't always disappear in a single disaster. Sometimes the world simply stops needing them, and slowly, quietly, they fade. This is Where America Faded, stories of towns that time left behind. Subscribe and join us for the next forgotten place.